My sister didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse me of anything outright. She just tilted her head, pressed her lips together the way she always did when she wanted to sound reasonable, and said, "You're being too sensitive." The room went quiet after that. Not tense, not angry, just done. I stood there with my hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold minutes ago, waiting for someone to ask what I meant, or why I was concerned, or even what had actually changed. No one did. My mother nodded slightly, as if the explanation made sense. My father looked down at his phone. The conversation moved on without me, sliding neatly into plans that apparently no longer required my input. It wasn't the words themselves that stunned me. It was how quickly they worked. One sentence, delivered softly, and suddenly my question no longer mattered. My concern had been transformed into a flaw. I hadn't been answered. I had been labeled. I opened my mouth to try again, to clarify that I wasn't upset, that I just wanted to understand why the schedule had changed without anyone telling me. But the moment had passed. The label hung in the air like a verdict, and I could feel it pressing me out of the conversation, the way a door closes without making a sound. That was the first time I realized how easily my voice could be erased. The decision they were discussing affected me directly. It wasn't theoretical or abstract. It was about timing, access, and a choice that had already been finalized before I'd even known there was a discussion. When I asked when this had been decided, my sister answered for me, explaining to the room that I'd been overwhelmed lately and that it was better this way. Easier for everyone. I remember thinking how carefully she chose her words. Nothing sounded cruel. Nothing sounded wrong. She framed everything as concern, as protection, as responsibility. And because she sounded calm, because she sounded kind, no one questioned her. I tried once more, carefully. I said I didn't feel overwhelmed. I said I would have appreciated being asked. I kept my voice steady. I made sure my tone was neutral. I had learned over time that emotion was dangerous currency in my family. My sister smiled at me then, the same smile she used when correcting a child. "See," she said lightly, "this is what I mean. You're taking it personally." That was when the conversation ended for good. They moved on to logistics. Dates were confirmed. Names were mentioned. Someone wrote something down. I stood there listening to my own life being organized without me, feeling a strange mix of embarrassment and disbelief. It wasn't that they disagreed with me. It was that they no longer saw me as a reliable narrator of my own experience. Later that day, I replayed the moment in my head over and over, trying to pinpoint where I had gone wrong. Had I sounded sharp, defensive, emotional? The more I examined it, the more unsettling the truth became. It hadn't mattered how I'd spoken. The outcome had been decided the moment my sister applied that label. This wasn't the first time she'd done it. I could trace it back to smaller moments, earlier conversations where my concerns were brushed aside with the same phrase. Too sensitive, overreacting, taking things the wrong way. Each time it had seemed minor enough to let go. Each time I'd told myself it wasn't worth the argument. But this time was different. This time something concrete had been taken from me, quietly and efficiently, under the cover of concern. That evening, I checked my email out of habit, not expecting anything unusual. Buried between routine messages was a confirmation notice. It referenced a change I hadn't agreed to, dated earlier that week. A decision that had already been logged, approved, and scheduled. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. The timestamp didn't match the story I'd been told. According to this, the decision had been made days before I ever asked a question, before I ever had a chance to be too sensitive about it. I didn't forward the email. I didn't bring it up at dinner. I didn't march back into the living room demanding answers. I just sat there, the glow of the screen reflecting off the wall, feeling something shift inside me. For the first time, I wondered if this wasn't about my reactions at all. If I had spoken up sooner, would anything have changed? Or had the process already been moving, quietly, efficiently, counting on the assumption that I wouldn't push too hard? That if I did, the label would take care of me? I closed my laptop and went to bed without saying anything to anyone. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that suggests resolution. Everyone else seemed comfortable, as if the matter had been settled properly. Lying there in the dark, I realized how dangerous that comfort was. Decisions had been made, records had been created, and I had been removed from the story without a single argument. They thought the problem was my sensitivity. I was starting to think the problem was something else entirely. I told myself that the next time I would handle it better. I rehearsed the words in my head before I said them, smoothing out anything that could be misheard as emotion. I chose a moment when everyone was calm, when no one was rushing out the door or distracted. I wasn't looking for an argument. I wasn't even looking for agreement. I just wanted to correct what I thought was a misunderstanding. When I brought it up, I kept my voice even. I asked why the decision had been made before I was told about it. I said I understood the intent, but I would have liked to be included. I watched my tone carefully, the way you might watch your footing on ice. My sister responded with a sigh that sounded patient, almost tender. She leaned back in her chair and looked at me the way someone looks at a person who doesn't realize how tired they seem. "We didn't want to overwhelm you," she said. "You've been through a lot lately." I said I didn't feel overwhelmed. She smiled again, the same small, reassuring smile. "That's exactly what I mean," she said. "You don't always see it when it's happening." The conversation shifted immediately. My concern was no longer the subject. I was. My mother glanced between us, then nodded. "She's just worried about you," she said, as if that settled everything. My father cleared his throat and suggested we talk about something else. The room closed ranks around the explanation my sister had provided, and suddenly my attempt at clarity had been reframed as proof that I needed managing. I felt heat rise in my chest, sharp and unwelcome. I tried to redirect us back to the actual issue, but my sister cut in smoothly, explaining that it had all been handled and that there was no need to revisit it now. The more calmly she spoke, the more unreasonable I seemed by comparison. I heard myself say, "I'm not upset." The words came out a little too fast. My sister's expression softened. "See?" she said gently. "This is why we didn't want to bring it to you sooner." That was the moment something in me snapped, not outwardly, not in any way anyone else could see. But I realized I was losing ground with every sentence. The more I explained myself, the more I confirmed the version of me they were comfortable believing. Someone else at the table laughed nervously and made a joke to lighten the mood. The tension dissolved for everyone except me. I sat there feeling exposed, my intentions twisted into something I hadn't meant at all. Later, when I replayed it, I saw the pattern clearly. The conversation had never been about the decision. It had been about control, about who was allowed to speak and who was allowed to be taken seriously. What unsettled me most was how practiced it all seemed. My sister didn't stumble over her words. She didn't get defensive. She spoke with the ease of someone who had used this approach before and knew it worked. And as I watched her, I noticed something else. There was someone else benefiting from this. It wasn't obvious at first. It was subtle, the way another family member stayed quiet when I spoke, then relaxed once the topic was closed. The way certain plans continued uninterrupted because I had been repositioned as an emotional variable instead of a decision maker. Silence, I realized, was convenient. Not just for my sister, but for everyone who didn't want complications. I tried once more to salvage the conversation, pointing out a specific detail that didn't line up with what I'd been told earlier. This time my voice did waver, just slightly. Enough. My sister seized on it instantly. "You're reacting again," she said, her tone almost apologetic. "This is what we were trying to avoid." I felt something tighten in my throat. I could hear the edge in my own voice now, despite my best efforts. And the moment I did, the verdict was sealed. I had become the problem they could point to, the distraction that allowed everything else to continue unquestioned. When the conversation ended, it ended decisively. There was no invitation to revisit it later, no suggestion of compromise. The decision stood, reinforced by the idea that revisiting it would only upset me further. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every word I'd said and every word I hadn't. I wasn't angry so much as bewildered. I had done everything I was supposed to do. I had been calm, reasonable, clear, and it hadn't mattered at all. In the days that followed, things moved quickly. Appointments were confirmed, timelines advanced. I heard about changes secondhand, always after the fact, always framed as settled. Each update came with the same undertone. This was for the best, and I would only complicate things if I objected. The more I spoke up, the faster everything seemed to move without me. I began to understand that my voice wasn't slowing anything down. It was being used as justification to exclude me further. Every attempt to reclaim my place in the conversation only made it easier to remove me from it. By the end of that week, I stopped trying to correct the narrative. Not because I agreed with it, but because I could see, finally, that speaking wasn't helping. It was feeding something I didn't fully understand yet. The realization settled over me quietly, without drama. If this was how they played the game, then I was going to have to learn a different way to respond. After that week, I stopped explaining myself. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no moment where I slammed a door or declared anything out loud. I just woke up one morning with the clear understanding that every word I had offered so far had been repurposed against me. Not twisted exactly, just reframed, softened into concern, redirected into proof that I was the problem. The house felt strangely calm once I made that decision. Conversations flowed more easily. My sister seemed lighter, almost relieved. It was as if the tension everyone claimed to feel had evaporated the moment I removed myself from the role of questioner. At breakfast, she announced another update, a small one, a detail about timing. Normally, I would have asked for clarification. Normally, I would have pointed out that this wasn't what we'd discussed before. This time, I said nothing. I buttered my toast. I nodded once. My sister glanced at me, just briefly. Her shoulders relaxed. I noticed that. Later that afternoon, she spoke for me on the phone, summarizing my situation to someone else while I sat a few feet away. Her version of me was calm, grateful, and slightly fragile, a person best handled, not consulted. I felt the familiar urge to interrupt, to correct a detail she'd gotten wrong. I didn't. The call ended smoothly. She smiled afterward, as if we'd accomplished something together. "That went well," she said. It struck me then how much easier everything became when I wasn't insisting on being heard. The first few days of silence were uncomfortable. I felt like I was shrinking, like I was letting something important slip away. My instincts told me this was what losing looked like, but underneath that fear was something else, something steadier. Clarity. Without the constant effort of managing how I sounded, I could finally pay attention to what was actually happening. I started noticing how often decisions were framed as already resolved, how frequently my sister used phrases like, "We've taken care of it," or "There's no need to worry about that now," how rarely anyone checked in with me directly, and how freely people spoke when they assumed I wouldn't challenge them. One evening, my sister mentioned a step she had taken earlier that week, casually, as if it had been obvious. She referenced a name I didn't recognize, a person I had never been introduced to, never heard discussed. Normally, I would have asked who that was. Normally, I would have asked why I hadn't been included. I stayed quiet. She didn't notice. Or maybe she did, but interpreted my silence as agreement. Either way, she kept talking, filling in details she hadn't bothered to share before, dates, conversations, decisions that had apparently happened without me. Each word landed heavily, but I let them fall. I began to understand something important. My silence wasn't creating the illusion of peace. It was removing the obstacle that had forced everyone else to be careful. Without my questions, there was no need to justify anything. No need to simplify. No need to pretend this was collaborative. In that absence, patterns started to emerge. I noticed how often my sister answered questions that weren't directed at her, How quickly she stepped in when someone looked my way. How comfortable she was speaking on my behalf, now that she no longer expected resistance. And I noticed something else, too. She started making small mistakes. Not obvious ones. Not anything that would raise alarms. Just little assumptions. Comments that skipped steps. References to things that hadn't been said out loud before. It was the kind of carelessness that comes from confidence, from believing you've already won. At dinner one night, she mentioned that everything was on track, and that there was nothing left for me to do. The phrasing struck me. Nothing left for me to do, as if there had ever been a moment when I'd been invited to do anything at all. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the reflex to push back. I didn't. I realized then that staying quiet wasn't the same as giving up. It was choosing not to play the role I'd been assigned. They expected emotion, confusion, gratitude even. What they didn't expect was restraint. That restraint gave me space. Space to listen. Space to remember details without the haze of frustration. Space to notice inconsistencies I'd missed before because I'd been too busy defending myself. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was observing. The shift changed how I felt about myself, too. Without the constant need to prove I was reasonable, I stopped questioning my own perceptions. I trusted what I was seeing. I trusted that my discomfort meant something, even if I wasn't naming it yet. One afternoon, as my sister spoke animatedly about how smoothly everything was going, she said something that made my stomach drop. "It's already handled," she said. "You don't have to worry about any of that." The certainty in her voice was absolute. There was no room in it for discussion, no room for correction. I nodded once, keeping my face neutral. Inside, something settled into place. This wasn't about protecting me. It wasn't about easing my burden. It was about control, exercised quietly, efficiently, and wrapped in the language of care. And my silence was letting her reveal exactly how far that control extended. As I went to bed that night, I understood that staying quiet wasn't the end of my voice. It was the beginning of a different kind of listening, one that would show me everything I needed to know. By the time I noticed the first inconsistency, I had already learned not to react. It was small enough that I might have missed it before. A change in timing, mentioned in passing, framed as a minor adjustment. Nothing urgent. Nothing worth getting upset over. I nodded when it was explained to me and went on with my day, telling myself it probably didn't matter. But later that evening, I replayed the conversation in my head and realized it didn't match what I'd been told earlier. I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at the quiet room, trying to decide whether my memory was unreliable or whether something had actually shifted. In the past, I would have gone to my sister immediately, asking for clarification, apologizing in advance for bothering her. This time, I didn't. A few days later, it happened again. Another small change. Another detail that didn't line up with the version of events I remembered. The explanation came smoothly, confidently, as if this was how it had always been. When I hesitated for half a second, my sister reassured me that it was all taken care of and that I didn't need to worry. I noticed how quickly she added that last part. I didn't argue. I didn't ask follow-up questions. I just listened. By the third time, it was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The changes weren't dramatic on their own. They were the kind of things people adjust all the time. But together they formed a rhythm. A pattern of decisions being made quietly, presented as settled facts, always after the moment when my input might have mattered. I started paying closer attention to the language people used around me. How often I heard "already handled" instead of "we discussed." How rarely anyone asked what I thought before moving on. How consistently the changes benefited efficiency and control, never transparency. There was a moment when one of these small decisions had an immediate effect on me. It caused inconvenience, yes, but also discomfort that could have been avoided with a simple conversation. I absorbed it without comment, even as part of me screamed that this was unfair. Staying quiet wasn't easy. It required a kind of discipline I hadn't known I possessed. Every instinct I had urged me to speak up, to correct the record, to insist that I deserved to be informed. But each time I resisted, something else sharpened instead. My awareness. Without the emotional surge of confrontation, I could see more clearly. I noticed dates. I noticed names. I noticed how often my sister spoke in absolutes, leaving no space for negotiation. I noticed how comfortable everyone else seemed when I didn't challenge the flow of things. I began to understand that silence wasn't making me invisible. It was making everything else visible. One afternoon, my sister mentioned a document in passing, referring to it as if I had already seen it. I hadn't. The way she said it suggested she believed I wouldn't question that assumption. I kept my expression neutral and let the conversation continue. Later, when I was alone, I searched for the document. It didn't take long to find a reference to it buried in a chain of emails I hadn't been included on. The dates stood out immediately. They confirmed what I had suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Decisions were being made without me, then backfilled with explanations designed to keep me calm. I sat back in my chair and let the realization settle. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't confusion. It was organized, efficient, designed to move forward without resistance. The most unsettling part was how normal it all looked on the surface. No raised voices, no ultimatums. Just a steady narrowing of my role until I existed only at the edges of conversations about my own life. That night, I lay awake, replaying everything I had noticed over the past 2 weeks. The pattern was undeniable now. Each inconsistency reinforced the last, forming a clear line that pointed to intention rather than oversight. I thought about how easily this could have continued if I hadn't slowed down. If I had kept reacting emotionally, I would have been dismissed every time, the label would have done its work, and the process would have rolled on untouched. The realization made my chest tighten, not with anger, but with something colder: understanding. The next morning, my sister breezed into the room and announced another update. She spoke confidently, efficiently, already halfway to the next topic. I listened carefully, matching her calm with my own. When she finished, she looked at me, perhaps expecting a question. I smiled faintly and said nothing. She took that as agreement and moved on. As the day unfolded, I found myself replaying her words, testing them against what I now knew. The gaps were everywhere once I started looking. Gaps that could no longer be explained away as misunderstandings or bad timing. By the end of that day, I understood something fundamental. This wasn't about how I felt. It was about what was being done. And for the first time, I stopped thinking about how to explain myself and started thinking about how to understand the full scope of what was happening around me. If these were the inconsistencies I could see, I wondered how many more were hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice them. I didn't call anyone after that. I didn't ask for clarification or reassurance. I opened a blank document on my laptop and typed the date at the top. That was it. Just the date. No feelings, no commentary. I stared at the screen for a moment, surprised by how steady my hands were. Then I added the time, and beneath it, a single sentence describing exactly what had been said that morning. The wording mattered. I copied it as closely as I could remember, resisting the urge to soften it or explain it. When I finished, I leaned back and waited for the wave of guilt to hit. It didn't. Instead, there was a strange sense of order, as if I had finally placed something heavy down where it belonged. I told myself this wasn't a diary. Diaries were emotional. This was something else. A record. A timeline. A way of anchoring reality outside my head so it couldn't be reshaped later. The next entry came sooner than I expected. An email arrived that afternoon, confirming a detail my sister had mentioned casually the day before. I read it twice, then opened my document and added another line. Date, time, subject line, no adjectives, no reaction. I noticed how easy it was to keep going once I started. Conversations I would have dismissed as insignificant before now felt different when I wrote them down. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were precise. Each entry captured a moment exactly as it happened, stripped of interpretation. I made rules for myself that night. I wrote them at the top of the document above the entries so I wouldn't forget. Document only what occurred. Use exact words when possible. No assumptions, no conclusions. If I broke those rules, this would turn into another emotional outlet. I didn't want that. I wanted something that could stand on its own. Over the next few days, the file grew quietly. A confirmation here. A note about a conversation there. Times when decisions were referenced as already made, names that appeared without explanation. Each entry was small, but together they began to carry weight. What surprised me most was how much I had access to once I started looking. Information had always been there, scattered and easy to miss. It was only invisible when I wasn't paying attention. My sister remained relaxed. If anything, she seemed more confident now. She spoke freely, assuming I was aligned with her version of events. When she summarized things for other people, she did it efficiently, without checking to see if I agreed. I wrote down what she said afterward. Carefully, exactly. At dinner one evening, she mentioned a call she'd had earlier that day. She spoke about it as if I had known about it already. I hadn't. I didn't interrupt. I let her finish, then added another entry later that night. Date, time, call, referenced. No prior notice given. I felt anger flicker as I typed, but it stayed contained, pressed flat by the structure I'd built around it. The act of documenting gave the feeling somewhere to go without spilling over. A few days later, I reviewed what I had written so far, not to analyze it, just to read it as a sequence. That was when I saw it. The repetition. The same steps occurring again and again, decisions moving forward first, explanations arriving later, always framed as concern for my well-being. The same people involved, the same timing, the same assumption that I didn't need to be included. This wasn't a series of isolated moments. It was a process. I closed the document and sat there for a long time staring at the wall. The realization was unsettling, but it was also clarifying. If this was a system, then reacting emotionally had never stood a chance. Systems don't respond to feelings. They respond to pressure, structure, and proof. The next entry came from a place I hadn't expected. An automated message arrived late one evening, triggered by a change I hadn't been told about yet. The language was neutral, procedural, impossible to misinterpret. I compared it to the entry I'd made 2 days earlier about a conversation with my sister. They matched. I copied the timestamp into my document and sat very still, my heart beating a little faster than before. This wasn't my memory or my perception. This was confirmation. I didn't tell anyone I'd found it. I didn't forward the message or ask why I hadn't been included. I just saved it and added another line to the file. By the end of that week, the document had taken on a shape of its own. It wasn't long, but it was dense. Every entry supported the others. Each one made the next harder to dismiss. What struck me then was how little I needed anyone's acknowledgement anymore. I wasn't building this to convince my family. I was building it so the truth wouldn't depend on my tone, my calm, or my ability to stay composed in the moment. I began to understand the quiet power in what I was doing. While everyone else assumed the situation was settled, I was assembling something that didn't argue, didn't accuse, and didn't react. It simply existed, waiting. That night, as I closed my laptop, a thought settled in with surprising calm. If this continued, someone with authority would eventually need to see it. And when they did, it wouldn't matter how sensitive I was or wasn't. The record would speak for itself. I waited until the house was quiet before I opened the file again, not because I was hiding it, but because I wanted to see it the way someone else might, without interruptions, without the noise of daily life blurring the edges. I read from the first entry straight through, forcing myself not to pause, not to explain anything away. Halfway through, I stopped pretending these were isolated notes. They weren't. They lined up too neatly for that. Dates repeated. Names reappeared. The same decisions moved forward in the same order every time, always before I was informed, always after someone else had spoken for me. When I stopped reading each entry as a moment and started reading them as a sequence, the shape of it emerged with unsettling clarity. This wasn't confusion. It was choreography. I went back to the top and read again, slower this time, marking connections I hadn't seen before. A call referenced here matched a confirmation there. A delay explained, as concern lined up perfectly with a window where consent would have been required. The pattern didn't shout. It didn't need to. It was steady and consistent, like a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. What changed for me in that moment wasn't just understanding, it was scale. Up until then, the harm had felt personal, inconvenient, disrespectful, painful in ways that were easy to minimize. Now I could see the consequences stretching further than I'd allowed myself to imagine. This wasn't just about being left out of conversations, it was about authority over decisions that affected my time, my access, and eventually my future. Money was threaded through it, subtly at first. Not overt transactions, but positioning. Who was consulted? Who signed off? Who was informed after the fact? I hadn't wanted to think about that aspect because it made everything feel heavier, more deliberate. But the file didn't flinch from it, so neither could I. I thought back to how often my sister had emphasized simplicity, efficiency, how often she framed my involvement as something that would complicate matters. The words sounded benevolent until I saw how effectively they removed me from the process. I closed my laptop and stared at the wall, feeling the weight of it settle into my chest. There was a moment, brief but sharp, when I wanted to confront her immediately, to lay everything out and demand an explanation. The urge came from a place of instinct, not strategy. I let it pass. Confrontation would feel satisfying, but it would also be predictable. It would turn this back into a debate about feelings, intentions, tone. I could already hear the response. I was reading too much into it. I was stressed. I was sensitive. I wasn't interested in giving that narrative new life. Instead, I kept watching. Once I knew what to look for, the cracks appeared more often. My sister grew slightly careless, the way people do when they believe they're no longer being questioned. She spoke about future steps as if they were settled, timelines as if they were fixed. She referenced approvals that hadn't been mentioned before, assuming I understood the context. I wrote it all down later, dates, phrases, the exact wording she used. One afternoon, she let something slip that connected several threads at once. A name, a role, and a date that overlapped in a way that made my stomach drop. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't hesitate or correct herself. She just kept talking. I didn't interrupt. That single detail clarified what the others had only suggested. It showed intent, planning, a sequence that depended on me being passive long enough for it to complete itself. I sat with that realization longer than I wanted to. Accepting it meant accepting that this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. It was a strategy that had already factored in my objections and found a way around them. The strange thing was how calm I felt once I stopped resisting that truth. There was grief in it, of course, a quiet mourning for the version of our relationship I had believed in. But there was also focus, direction. Knowing what you're dealing with has a way of simplifying things, even when what you're dealing with is painful. That night, I added a new section to the file. Not commentary, just organization. I grouped entries by theme, by person involved, by type of decision. I wasn't embellishing anything, I was clarifying it. When I finished, I leaned back and looked at the structure I'd created. It no longer felt like notes, it felt like evidence. That was when another thought surfaced, one I hadn't allowed myself before. This couldn't stay private, not because I wanted revenge or validation, but because systems like this don't correct themselves. They continue until something interrupts them. And whatever that interruption was, it wouldn't come from another emotional appeal. It would come from someone with authority who couldn't be dismissed with a label. The idea didn't frighten me the way I expected it to. It felt inevitable. The file had grown beyond me now. It wasn't about my hurt or my patience. It was about accuracy, about accountability. The next morning, my sister spoke confidently about how smoothly everything was progressing. She didn't ask for my input. She didn't need to. She believed the process was secure. I listened, calm and attentive, storing the details for later. Inside, something had shifted permanently. I wasn't trying to be heard anymore. I was preparing to be understood. She spoke about the future as if it were already settled. We were standing in the hallway, the kind of narrow space where conversations tend to be brief and practical. She mentioned a step that would happen later this year, said it casually, with the confidence of someone reciting a plan that no longer required approval. The certainty in her voice caught my attention more than the words themselves. Later this year, as if there were no variables left. I nodded, the way I had learned to do, and waited for the feeling to pass. Instead, something else surfaced. A memory I hadn't thought about in a long time, rising quietly but insistently, demanding to be re-examined. It was from months earlier, before any of this had started to feel wrong. We had been sitting in the same kitchen, the same table between us. She'd brought up a hypothetical situation then, framed as curiosity. What would I want if certain responsibilities became too much? Would I be open to letting someone else handle things for me, just temporarily? At the time, I'd laughed it off. I told her I didn't see the need, that I was fine. She'd smiled and said she was just thinking ahead. I remembered feeling slightly uneasy, but I'd dismissed it as my own overthinking. Now, standing in the hallway, that conversation replayed itself with a clarity that made my stomach tighten. It hadn't been hypothetical at all. The flashback sharpened as I let it run its course. I remembered the way she'd phrased her questions, how she'd positioned herself as a solution to a problem that hadn't yet been acknowledged. I remembered how quickly she'd moved on when I said no, as if the answer hadn't mattered. Back then, I hadn't had a file, I hadn't had a pattern. All I'd had was a feeling, easily overridden by the assurance that she was looking out for me. I returned to the present with a cold understanding that made the air around me feel thinner. This hadn't begun when I was labeled too sensitive. That label had come later, once the groundwork was already in place. It had been a tool, not the strategy itself. A way to smooth over resistance when the time came to act. I thought about how useful my emotional reactions must have been, how neatly they justified excluding me from conversations, how easily they allowed her to frame control as protection. The more I reacted, the more reasonable she appeared. Silence, I realized, had disrupted that rhythm. That was why she sounded so confident now. She believed the moment of resistance had passed. She believed I had accepted my role. We sat down later that evening, and she spoke again about what was coming next. Her language was precise, practiced. She didn't ask what I thought. She didn't need to. She spoke as if my agreement were already implied. Then she slipped. It was subtle, just a reference to a conversation I hadn't been part of. A decision she described as if it had included me, even though it hadn't. She didn't notice the discrepancy, or maybe she assumed I wouldn't either. I stayed quiet, my face carefully neutral. Inside, everything clicked into place. This wasn't a misunderstanding that had grown out of control. It was a sequence, one that began with positioning, continued with narrative control, and relied on my discrediting to function smoothly. The label wasn't an insult. It was a mechanism. I felt a brief wave of grief then, sharp and unexpected. Not for what I'd lost recently, but for what I'd believed before. For the trust I'd placed in her intentions. For the ease with which I'd accepted explanations instead of questioning the structure beneath them. The grief passed quickly, replaced by resolve. Understanding intent changes the rules of engagement. Once you see the shape of a strategy, you stop arguing with it. You plan around it. That night, I opened the file again and added a new entry. Not just the slip itself, but the context, the assumption embedded in her words, the way the past conversation now aligned with present actions. I didn't write how it made me feel. I didn't need to. The facts carried their own weight. When I finished, I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the quiet of the house. I felt strangely calm. There was no longer any doubt to wrestle with, no internal debate about whether I was being unfair or imagining things. Clarity has a way of simplifying even the most complicated emotions. The next day, my sister acted as if nothing had changed. She was efficient, directive, certain. She continued speaking for me when it suited her, confident that I wouldn't interrupt. She was wrong about that part, but not in the way she expected. I wasn't planning to interrupt her narrative with another version of events. I wasn't interested in correcting her in front of anyone. That would only return us to the same familiar ground, where tone mattered more than truth. What I had now was something different. I had a record that stretched back before the label, before the concern, before the justification. A record that showed this hadn't been reactive. It had been intentional. As I listened to her speak that afternoon, outlining steps that assumed my absence from the decision-making process, I felt the last traces of hesitation fall away. This wasn't about understanding her anymore. It was about preparing for what came next. The room was quieter than I expected. It wasn't dramatic or tense, just controlled. Neutral walls, a narrow table, 2 chairs on one side and one on the other. My sister walked in first and took the seat closest to the desk, already arranging her papers as if she'd been there before. I followed and sat slightly back, hands folded in my lap, my posture careful and still. She didn't ask if I wanted to speak first. She never did. From the moment the conversation began, she positioned herself as the interpreter of my needs. She summarized my situation in smooth, efficient sentences, using the same language she always did: concerned, protective, responsible. I listened as she spoke about me in the third person, describing my reactions, my limitations, my supposed preferences. I watched the person across the desk nod and take notes. Every now and then, the authority figure glanced at me, briefly, as if checking for confirmation. Each time my sister filled the space before I could. "She's been under a lot of stress," she said at one point, "so we've been trying to keep things simple." I didn't correct her. I could feel the weight of my silence in the room, but I held it steady. My face stayed neutral. My hands didn't move. The stillness was deliberate, and it did something interesting. It made her talk more. Without interruption, she expanded. She explained decisions in greater detail, filling in context she hadn't bothered to share with me before. She referenced conversations I hadn't been part of, timelines I hadn't seen, agreements I hadn't made. She spoke with confidence, assuming consistency where none existed. I noticed the first pause when she said something definitive about consent. The word hung there for a moment longer than it should have. The authority figure looked up from the notes and asked a follow-up question, phrased carefully, neutrally. My sister answered too quickly. She over-explained, layering reassurance on top of assurance, her voice just a shade more animated than before. I watched the pen slow as the person across from us wrote, then paused again. Still, I said nothing. There was a moment when a question was directed at me directly. It wasn't confrontational. It wasn't loaded. Just a simple inquiry about my understanding of a specific step in the process. I lifted my eyes and answered with one sentence. A factual sentence. It contradicted my sister's account without accusing her of anything. I didn't elaborate. I didn't defend myself. I simply stated what I knew to be true, and then fell quiet again. The room shifted, not dramatically, not visibly. But the tone changed, like a current moving under the surface. The authority figure nodded slowly, making a note, and asked another question, this time clarifying a date. My sister answered, but her confidence wavered just enough to be noticeable. I stayed still, letting the conversation unfold without me steering it. As the meeting continued, I became aware of something I hadn't expected. My silence wasn't making me disappear. It was drawing attention. Each time my sister spoke for me, the contrast grew sharper. Each time I didn't interrupt, the space around her explanations widened. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been resolved, no decisions were reversed, no conclusions were announced. My sister gathered her papers with the same efficiency she'd brought them in, clearly satisfied that things had gone as planned. As we stood to leave, the authority figure looked at me again, this time holding the gaze for a fraction longer. "Thank you for coming," they said, their tone neutral but thoughtful. My sister smiled, already moving toward the door. "We appreciate you taking the time," she replied. I followed her out into the hallway, my steps measured, my mind quiet. She spoke immediately, filling the space with casual commentary about how smoothly everything had gone. I nodded, offering nothing in return. She didn't notice the shift. That came later. The follow-up email arrived the next morning. Polite, professional, addressed to me. It asked if I would be available for a brief one-on-one conversation to clarify a few points raised during the meeting. I read it twice, then closed my laptop without responding right away. It wasn't the request itself that mattered. It was the fact that it existed at all. The narrative my sister had built required her to be the sole voice. A direct request to me disrupted that structure in a way no argument ever could. When I agreed to the meeting, I didn't tell anyone. I spent the time before it organizing the file again, not adding anything new, just making sure everything was clear and accessible, chronological, precise, clean. I reminded myself that I wasn't there to persuade or accuse. I was there to be accurate. The meeting was brief. The questions were direct. The tone was neutral. I answered the same way I had before, with facts only, dates, words, sequences, no speculation. When it ended, the authority figure thanked me and said they would be reviewing the information internally. There was no reaction to read into, no validation offered, just process. As I walked away, I felt something solid settle in my chest. For the first time, the narrative no longer belonged to my sister. It hadn't been taken from her loudly or publicly. It had simply begun to unravel under its own weight, exposed by the space I'd refused to fill with explanations. That night, as my sister spoke confidently about the next steps, unaware of the follow-up that had already happened, I listened with the same calm attention I'd practiced for weeks. She believed control meant speaking the most. I was beginning to understand that control meant knowing when not to. The message came the next afternoon, short and professional, asking if I could meet privately to go over a few clarifications. I read it once, then again, letting the words settle without rushing to respond. There was no urgency in the tone, no hint of accusation. Just process, just procedure. That alone told me something had shifted. I agreed to the meeting and didn't mention it to anyone. Preparing didn't take long. I already knew what I would bring and what I wouldn't. I printed the records in chronological order, each page clean and uncluttered. Dates at the top, times where they mattered, exact language where I could provide it. I left out commentary, explanations, and anything that could be read as emotional framing. This wasn't a story. It was a sequence. When I arrived, the office felt different without my sister beside me, quieter, more direct. The authority figure greeted me politely and gestured to the chair across the desk. There was no small talk, no attempt to soften the moment. They asked me to walk them through my understanding of the timeline. I didn't start at the beginning of the conflict. I started with the first documented decision made without my knowledge, then moved forward, step by step. I spoke slowly, pausing when needed, referring to the pages in front of us instead of relying on memory. Each time a question came up, I answered it the same way, factually, briefly. When I finished, I slid the file across the desk. "I've kept a record," I said. "It's just what happened, in order." There was no reaction at first. The authority figure opened the folder and began turning pages, scanning rather than reading closely. I watched their expression change in subtle ways. The pace slowed. A finger traced a line of text. A page was turned back, then forward again. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary. At one point, they asked how long I'd been documenting everything. I gave the date. They nodded and continued reviewing, making notes in the margin of their own pad. I noticed how little I felt in that moment. No adrenaline, no fear, just a steady sense of rightness. The record was doing what it was meant to do. It didn't argue or insist. It simply existed, undeniable in its order. After a while, they closed the folder. "Thank you for organizing this so clearly," they said. "This will need to be reviewed against our internal records." There it was, the moment of no return. I asked what the next steps would be. They explained the process in neutral terms: cross-checking, verification, additional documentation if needed. I listened carefully, committing the details to memory, even though I knew they would likely be followed up in writing. I didn't ask how my sister would be involved. I didn't need to. As I stood to leave, the authority figure added something almost casually. "If there's anything else relevant that comes up, please let us know." I nodded. "I will." Walking out of the building, I felt lighter than I had in weeks, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was no longer confined to the space where it had been controlled. It had moved into a system that ran on records, not narratives. That evening, my sister spoke to me the way she always did, confident and unguarded. She mentioned timelines, next steps, how smoothly everything was progressing. I listened without interruption, noting the assumptions embedded in her words. She had no idea. Over the next few days, I watched small changes ripple outward. Emails arrived that included me directly. Questions were phrased more carefully. Conversations that used to happen around me now paused when I entered the room. No one said anything outright. No one acknowledged what had happened. But something had. I stayed disciplined. I continued documenting, adding only what was new, careful not to let anticipation or relief color the entries. The file remained what it had always been, a factual account, growing steadily, quietly. Then came the message confirming that a formal review was underway. It didn't name names. It didn't outline findings. It simply stated that discrepancies had been identified and that procedures were being evaluated accordingly. The language was dry, procedural, impossible to misread. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, letting the significance of that settle. This wasn't vindication. It wasn't an apology. It was something more durable: accountability. I thought back to the first time my sister had called me too sensitive. How easily that label had silenced me. How quickly it had shifted the conversation away from facts and into feelings. If I had tried to fight that label head-on, I would have lost. I could see that clearly now. Instead, I had stepped aside and let the record speak. That night, as I prepared for bed, I realized there was nothing left to explain. I didn't need to rehearse conversations or brace myself for confrontation. Whatever happened next would happen on paper, in processes that didn't care about tone or family dynamics. For the first time, the outcome didn't depend on my ability to stay composed under pressure. It depended on accuracy. And accuracy, I had learned, is a form of power that doesn't raise its voice. The waiting was quieter than I expected. There were no tense phone calls, no urgent messages demanding clarification. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm while something important happened just out of sight. I went to work. I made dinner. I listened to my sister talk confidently about plans that assumed nothing had changed. I knew better. The review took place without me in the room, which turned out to be a relief. I didn't have to explain myself again or manage anyone's reactions. The process moved forward on its own terms, guided by documents and timelines that no one could interrupt or reframe. Days passed. Then more days. When the first response came, it wasn't dramatic. It arrived as a short, formal message requesting a follow-up conversation. The tone was neutral, professional, almost detached. I recognized that tone now. It meant something had been found. In the meeting, the authority figure didn't mention my sister by name. They didn't describe motives or intentions. They didn't need to. Instead, they spoke in precise language about discrepancies between reported processes and documented actions, about steps that had occurred without proper consent, about patterns that did not align with policy. They used the word inconsistent more than once. I listened carefully, hands folded, posture still. There was no surge of vindication, no urge to interrupt. I didn't need to add anything. The facts had already done the work. As they explained their findings, I realized something important. No one was debating whether I was sensitive or not. My emotions were no longer relevant to the conversation. The story that had been told about me simply didn't function in this context. The records didn't agree. That phrase stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Not because it felt triumphant, but because it was so final. There was no room in it for interpretation or tone. It wasn't an opinion, it was a conclusion. The changes that followed were subtle but unmistakable. Procedures were adjusted, communication protocols shifted. I began receiving information directly instead of through intermediaries. Decisions that had once been presented as settled were now framed as discussions, complete with timelines and options. No announcement was made, no apology was offered, but the control had been removed. I noticed the difference most clearly in my sister. She didn't confront me, she didn't ask what I had said or what I had shared. Instead, her certainty fractured in small, revealing ways. She asked more questions than she answered. She hesitated before speaking for me. When she did speak, she checked my expression first. The label disappeared. No one called me too sensitive anymore, not because they'd changed their minds, but because the label had lost its usefulness. It no longer explained anything. It no longer justified exclusion. I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. I had imagined this moment differently when I first started documenting everything. I'd assumed there would be some kind of release, some rush of relief or validation. Instead, there was a quiet sense of alignment. Things were finally where they should have been all along. The story about me had collapsed under its own weight. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt watching that happen. There was no thrill in seeing my sister lose ground, no pleasure in the shift of power. What I felt instead was distance, a clear boundary between who I was and the narrative that had been imposed on me. I hadn't won anything. I had been restored. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the mirror and noticed how different I looked. Not physically, but in the way I held myself. I spoke less. I explained less. When I did speak, I didn't hedge or soften my words. I trusted that I would be heard. Later that week, I received another message outlining the updated procedures going forward. Everything was documented, everything was transparent. The system had corrected itself, not because someone had argued well, but because the evidence demanded it. I closed my laptop and sat there for a long time, absorbing what that meant. This wasn't justice in the dramatic sense. There was no confrontation, no reckoning scene where everything was laid bare. But there was accountability, and it was far more durable than any emotional victory could have been. That evening, my sister spoke cautiously about future plans, leaving space for my input. She asked what I thought before moving on. The shift was unmistakable. I answered simply. There was no need to elaborate. As I went to bed that night, I thought back to the beginning, to the moment when my concern had been dismissed with a single phrase. Too sensitive. It had felt like an ending then, like a door closing. Now I understood it differently. It had been a signal. Not that my voice was flawed, but that the truth needed a different way to be heard. The records had spoken, and once they did, the story that had been told about me no longer mattered at all. Nothing looked different on the surface. The same routines continued. The same chairs were pulled out at the table. The same conversations drifted through the house in the evenings. If someone had walked in without context, they would have assumed nothing had changed at all. But I felt it immediately. The silence had shifted. It wasn't the silence of avoidance or tension. It was the silence of caution. Words were chosen more carefully now. Statements softened into questions. Decisions that used to be announced were suddenly framed as proposals. No one said my name when it happened. No one acknowledged the reason. They didn't have to. I noticed it first with my parents. They checked in before moving forward on things that affected me. Not dramatically, not apologetically, just correctly, as if this had always been the way it was meant to be done, and they were quietly correcting course. The absence of explanation was almost louder than any apology could have been. My sister changed too, though in a different way. She didn't pull me aside to talk. She didn't demand answers or confront me about the review. Instead, she became careful. She paused before speaking for me, then stopped doing it altogether. When someone asked a question that concerned me, she glanced in my direction and waited. The first time it happened, the room felt unfamiliar. I answered calmly, briefly, without over-explaining. No one interrupted me. No one reframed what I said. The moment passed without friction, but something fundamental had shifted underneath it. The label was gone. No one used the words "too sensitive" anymore. Not even indirectly. The phrase had lost its power, stripped of the role it once played. It couldn't justify anything now. It didn't fit the new reality. I realized then how much of the damage hadn't come from the label itself, but from how often I'd tried to fight it. How many times I'd over-explained, defended, softened my own experience in an effort to be understood. I didn't do that anymore. In the quiet that followed the review, I had space to notice my own reactions. I wasn't angry the way I thought I would be. I wasn't even relieved in the way people talk about relief. What I felt was distance. Distance from the version of myself who needed permission to trust her own perception. There were moments of grief, too. They came unexpectedly, usually late at night or in the middle of some ordinary task. Grief for the relationship I'd believed I had with my sister. For the trust I'd extended without realizing how it was being used. I let those moments pass without judging them. I didn't need closure from her. I didn't need an admission or a confession. The structure had already acknowledged what mattered. The rest was personal, and I was learning how to carry it quietly. One afternoon, my sister asked me what I thought about an upcoming decision. The question was simple, direct, no qualifiers, no concern-laced framing. I looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, not out of suspicion, but recognition. This was the first time she'd asked me outright in a long time. I gave my answer. She listened. That was it. No follow-up commentary, no correction, no explanation of why she'd asked in the first place. She nodded and moved on. It struck me then how little I wanted from her anymore. I wasn't waiting for her to acknowledge what she'd done. I wasn't hoping for a repair conversation or a softened version of the truth. What I wanted, I already had. My voice no longer required emotional labor to be heard. It didn't need careful packaging or strategic calm. It simply existed, and that was enough. I began to notice changes in myself as well. I spoke less, but with more certainty. I didn't rush to fill silences or justify my decisions. When I disagreed, I stated it plainly and stopped there. No one questioned my tone. The house felt different in a way I couldn't have explained before. Lighter, maybe, or more honest. Not because everything was resolved, but because the imbalance had been corrected. Control had lost its disguise. One evening, I sat alone in my room, reviewing the file one last time. I didn't add anything to it. I didn't reorganize or annotate. I just scrolled through it slowly, then closed it. I didn't feel the need to keep it open anymore. The record had done its job. It didn't need to grow. It didn't need to be referenced again unless something changed. For the first time since this had begun, I wasn't preparing for anything. I was living. That night, as the house settled into its familiar quiet, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't thinking about revenge at all. What I felt wasn't satisfaction at seeing my sister lose control, or triumph at being proven right. What I felt was restoration of my agency, of my dignity, of my trust in myself. The silence that once erased me now protected me, and in that quiet, steady space, I understood that this chapter was over, not because anyone had declared it closed, but because I no longer needed to fight for my place in it. Life didn't suddenly become dramatic or celebratory after that. It became quieter in a different way. The kind of quiet that comes when things are finally in their proper place. Mornings settled into a rhythm that no longer required me to brace myself. Conversations happened without that low hum of anticipation underneath them. When plans were discussed, They were discussed openly, with room for questions and adjustments, not presented as conclusions that had already been reached. Nothing flashy had changed, but everything important had. I realized over time that what I had mistaken for victory in the past was never what I actually wanted. I didn't need anyone to admit they were wrong. I didn't need a confrontation or a confession or a dramatic moment where everything was laid bare. What I needed was for my voice to stop being filtered through someone else's comfort, and that had already happened. The phrase, "too sensitive," drifted through my mind one afternoon as I stood at the sink, rinsing a coffee mug. It struck me how small it sounded now, how flimsy, how much power it had held only because I'd been trying so hard to prove it didn't apply to me. I hadn't changed my sensitivity. I'd changed the system around it. Sensitivity, I understood now, wasn't the weakness they'd made it out to be. It was awareness. It was noticing when something didn't align, when a story shifted just enough to matter. The problem had never been that I felt too much. The problem was that my feelings were used as a reason not to listen. Once emotion became the excuse, precision became the answer. I didn't fight louder. I didn't sharpen my tone. I didn't harden myself into someone I didn't recognize. I simply stepped back and let accuracy do what arguments never could. That realization followed me as I moved through the days. I found myself paying attention to how often people, especially women, were dismissed with similar language. Too emotional, too intense, too sensitive. The words were always delivered gently, framed as concern, but they carried the same effect. They ended conversations. I thought about how many times I had questioned my own perception because of that. How often I had wondered if I was imagining things instead of trusting what I was seeing. It was unsettling to recognize how effective that kind of dismissal could be, and how quietly it worked. What stayed with me most was how little force it had taken to undo it. No raised voices, no ultimatums, just consistency, documentation, patience. I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong anymore. I was trying to make sure the truth didn't depend on how calmly I could say it. There's a kind of revenge people talk about that's loud and satisfying in the moment. Mine wasn't that. Mine was quieter. It looked like restored agency. It felt like walking into a room and knowing I wouldn't be spoken over. It sounded like questions being asked instead of assumptions being made. It felt like dignity. Sometimes, late at night, I would think back to the version of myself who stood in that room weeks earlier, holding a cold mug and realizing she'd been erased from a conversation about her own life. I wished I could tell her what I know now, that she wasn't wrong for feeling unsettled, that silence wasn't surrender, that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. Most of all, I wished I could tell her that being labeled doesn't mean being defined. If you've ever been called too sensitive when you were simply paying attention, you already understand this story in your own way. You know how it feels to have your concerns reframed until they no longer sound valid, to watch decisions move forward while you're told to calm down. If that's you, I hope this reminds you of something important. Your awareness is not the problem. Your voice doesn't need permission, and when emotions are used to devalue you, accuracy can protect you in ways arguments never will. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. Not to debate it or analyze it, but to acknowledge it. Stories like this don't exist in isolation, and neither do the people who live them. If you want to stay with this space, where quiet strength matters and truth doesn't have to perform to be valid, consider staying a while. There are more stories like this one, and more conversations worth having. And if you found something here that made you feel seen, subscribing is a simple way to keep these stories alive. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to raise your voice, it's to make sure the truth has nowhere left to hide.